How do you optimize your online presence if you're a podcaster? This episode will be covering the 6 must have elements for podcasters. There are a few differences for podcasters who are amateurs from those who are trying to make it professionally. I'm Anna Xavier, and this is the Podcast Space, a practical podcast that will get you unstuck and will help you elevate on the online space. Let's go. Okay, before we dive into the 6 ones, I want to just share with you something that is important for me to let you know right now. These 6 elements are ideally things that you want to get done within your first year of podcasting. I've met a few podcasters down the road that are doing it professionally and haven't gotten to some of these, and that actually is impacting how they showcase online their expertise, but also how they are found by their listeners. Not all of them need to be done right away, and especially if you are someone who is not incredibly techy, but you may ask for help, or you may just want to stagger them across the year and get to them progressively. Let's start with the most important one, a website. I know that it sounds super obvious, but I've met so many podcasters who are professionals or who are entrepreneurs who do not own the domain of the name of their podcast. This is a risk because someone else can buy the domain that has your podcast name. So let's say I own my own domain. So my first and last name, Anna Xavier, it's mine. The Podcast Space happens to have the same name as the name of my company. I own that domain. But if I was to name it something else, I would absolutely buy the name of that domain. People just buy domains for the sake of it so they can resell it. So not owning your domain is a risk. And if you don't believe me, especially in the US, there are a lot of politicians who have not bought the domain name of their name. And so anyone can buy that domain name and make a website look super professional and just say the opposite of what they actually believe in, right? So imagine going to a website that has your own identity, photos, and everything, and it's not you, right? So with that, that's the first thing that I think you need to do is just buy your domain name for both your company and your website if you don't have it. You don't need to do anything with it, but make sure that you have them. And so even just thinking about your own website, if you're getting really anxious because you're not technical, there are so many websites. For instance, in terms of complexity, I believe that WordPress is one of the most complicated websites to buy because you just need a lot of plugins. The plugins crash a lot of times. And so I just don't think that's the best option if you feel super overwhelmed. Wix is a great option. One of my clients actually is on Wix, and they even have an integration with an RSS feed. It's called Podcast Player, I believe, and it even updates as soon as your podcast updates, which is awesome. Now, you may tell me, Anna, my podcast is already hosted somewhere. Let's say your podcast is hosted on Captivate, like mine is right now. You may say, hey, Captivate has captivate.com/the podcast space. Isn't that good enough? Well, if you're trying to build trust with your audience, if you're trying to make a stand in how professional you are, not having a domain name just doesn't look good enough. And even your hosting platform may not be great at the just at the layout. And finally, the SEO part of it. So when people are searching for you and the name of your podcast, you want them to be directed to a domain that you own, that you can control. And especially in the podcast industry, a lot of podcast hosting platforms are being bought out, or they are pivoting, or they're closing. Imagine if you've been podcasting for 2 years and the only kind of remains of existence are just that one hosting platform where your podcast was, right? That is scary because imagine all of that content being deleted. So you want to make sure that you're building with time that digital footprint, I would call it. So make sure that you're working towards building something that you own and you can control. So lastly, I like to share my website is on Squarespace, and I understand how coding works. I'm not a developer, but I have extensive understanding of how websites work. So sometimes coding something specific, making integrations work, it's a little more complex, but if you are someone that really loves good design, Squarespace has phenomenal designs and layouts. And again, you can make it just a landing page, which means it just has a podcast player and an about you, and then just kind of like a box where people can drop you emails. It can be as simple as that. So Number 2, if you already have a website for your business, let's say, but it's not the name of your podcast, one, again, as I was saying, do make sure that you buy that domain name, or alternatively, make sure that you have a podcast menu tab. And what that is that when people navigate to your website, they can absolutely see written podcast. Like the podcast tab is there. And while you may think, oh, Anna, it's overkilling, why do I need it? Because you have to remember that there are people that will be finding you first, and then they will find out that you have a podcast. So if you're not telling them that you have a podcast, how will they become listeners, right? So I feel like it's counterintuitive to have a show and not have it predominantly on your website, because we know that people who listen to podcasts are more likely to buy and trust the person who is talking. So if you already know that people are going to be trusting you more, why wouldn't you have that all over your website? But one last thing on that note, why you need a podcast tab on your website. I know, I know that this is, again, it's going to sound really silly if you already do this, but not a lot of people are podcasters. To you and maybe the circles you run around, you may think like, oh, everybody has a podcast. But looking at a podcast showcases a lot of things. That one, you have a commitment to your audience, that you are a thought leader, but also that you're really confident talking about things that you're passionate about or that you're just knowledgeable about, right? So, for instance, a few people may look into your podcast page and contact you to become a speaker, because if you don't have a speaking page, that is the most obvious thing that they're going to be looking for, right? So I want you to consider that, and it just makes the navigation easier for new timers. And also another one thing, for instance, on my website, because the name of the podcast is the same name of the company, I found it a little redundant to say, go to thepodcastspace.com/thepodcastspace. So instead, what I did was thepodcastspace.com/podcast. By the way, that's actually where you can always find resources and subscribe on the show. So I will say go to that page if you need inspiration, because it will be the best page. It's super simple, but it has all the information that you will need. Moving on to number 3, links to the podcast on your social media channels. I know this also sounds logical, but when I work with podcasters on doing podcast audits or podcast power hours, I always go there, and you would be amazed at the percentage. Out of the top of my head, I will say probably 25% of the clients that I've worked with in the past, they did not have their podcast on their accounts. And you may relate to this. You may be experiencing this. You may say, well, my podcast isn't necessarily what I do. Well, it still is part of who you are as a brand online, and it's important to let your listeners know. Or you may say, well, I was super overwhelmed with just starting the show and I just forgot to do it. With that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a tip in a second. But another reason why you need to access is because people will come to you at different stages. Remember that I was saying that sometimes they may find you on a Google search. Well, they may find you on a social media search. So they come across your content online. You want to make sure that it is as simple as possible to follow and subscribe to your podcast. Now, what I did was I used to have a link tree. But again, for the same reason of driving traffic to my own website and not an external website, which is Linktree, I decided to create a simple page that has, an image of my face. It has the name of the podcast. So it's the podcast space. I think it says an ethical and practical podcast. And then the links, not a lot. I think I have a link to subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, book a podcast power hour, and the 2 courses that I have. So again, not a lot. It's super simple to see. And now I'm driving traffic again for my own website, and people are already there. So it just makes the whole thing seamless. Moving on to the bio document, or that may be something like a media sheet. So you want to make sure that you have a short bio, no more than, I would say, honestly, 3 paragraphs, because you want to make sure that people can find information about you if they are trying to decide if you want to invite you on their show or be a guest on your show. Also, it simplifies the process of creating show notes for the other person. I feel like when I invite someone, or actually, it's not that I invite someone, because normally I only invite people who I know are already doing, good things. I don't invite people who are amateurs. And so it's actually when I'm looking at being a guest on a podcast, I'm like trying to find more things about the host. And this is such a great opportunity to also provide a fun way for the other person to connect with you. And so what else should be included in the bio? I actually like including the topics that I can cover, or like suggested questions. The easier I can make it on the host or on the guest to understand what I am an expert in, the better. Always give. And then that bio document also has links to my social media and some highlights, things that I think that are important for them to know. Like, for instance, if I have like a degree that is relevant, stuff like that. Also, make sure that you include a headshot that is high quality and is kind of versatile on that bio document, because people want to see how you look like, right? So that's important to know. And then number 5, if you have all of these already, make sure they have a public page that people can access to find out more about you. So if you don't have an about page, make sure you create one. Sometimes I go to podcast websites and there's nothing about the host. There's nothing about, like the podcast itself. There's just a player. And I'm like, oh, how can I find out information about them? Like, you're making me do the work. And if I have to do a ton of work, I'm going to close the page. So make sure that you have a public page, that it can be, again, the podcast page, or if you just say about me, right? And you have the bio document that is downloadable. You attach it somewhere that is like a PDF or something like that. It could be also something that you attach on a Google Drive folder. And again, everything must be in one location. So headshots and approved headshots. I cannot tell you how important this is. If you want to be like an extra person, provide headshots. They work very well both in portrait mode and on landscape mode. So vertical and horizontal. A lot of people like to create graphics, promotional graphics that are looking different. So, something that is for LinkedIn should be optimized for landscape mode, so rectangle. So make sure that your headshot is approved. Unfortunately, in the past, I was a producer for shows that the guest did not provide a really good headshot. And so it just looked very, very amateur. So you want to make sure that you look professional, and also that the headshot is up to date. One time, I swear, it was so embarrassing for me, because the person, their headshot was 30 years old. And so when I came into the studio, I did not recognize them, because one, they had significantly aged. Some people don't change that much, but that person had aged significantly. Also, they had a different color and the hairstyle was completely different. And so I did not recognize them. And then I was like, oh, that's weird. So also, if you're a woman, just get over yourself. Get your new photos the way that they depict you. Especially, it's almost like a trust thing. So if you're not having up-to-date photos, one, I feel like you may not take yourself seriously enough, or two, that if you can't show how you look right now, I'm going to have trust issues. I'm sorry. That's what's going to happen. So make sure that you have up-to-date headshots that also, again, they are ideally versatile. So no crop heads, no selfies that show the arm. That just looks amateur, right? And again, you can ask a friend to take photos of you. Ideally, one of the best ways to do it is actually not to do it super close to a wall. Try to create a little bit of depth. That creates a lot of interest. And again, no cropped things, like the shoulders should be visible, the head should be visible, a little bit of body just for the person to play around. And then if you can, on that same bio document, also have links to your offers or links to your website. It's very common for podcasters who do have a chance to have some extra time to create a specific offer for when they're guesting on other shows. So let's say I want to track how many people are coming. I can say, hey, go to thepodcastspace.com, /guest, and you will be able to get on my email list. You'll receive a freebie there, right? So I know that people that go to that page have been coming through podcasts that I've been a guest on, and that I quantify the success of it. I feel like I'm giving a lot of goodies on these episodes. And then number 6, a calendar link that people can book directly through it. So I know that right now you're like, Anna, what is the problem with emailing back and forth? Well, when you're trying to combine multiple podcast interviews, or if you're trying to get someone that is relevant, sometimes they don't have the capacity to email you in real time. And so it's going to make the booking process so much more difficult. And it adds so many more steps on your side. You want to automate, you want to make sure that you're looking as sharp as possible. So make sure that you create something like a Calendly link that is free. And I'm going to put the links in the show notes that you can just like access it. But having a link where people can book, they also simplifies the process for them. Two bad experiences that I had on shows that really stresses me out that I want to share with you. So the host did not give me a calendar link to book, so I added manually, and there was a time zone difference. So I kept wondering, I was like, oh, am I booking at the right time? I can't forget about this interview. So if you are on the host seat, there's a big chance of that person missing that podcast interview because you didn't do the most basic thing, which is just make their life easier and ensure that they didn't forget. Even if it's a calendar link, digital calendar link, I cannot say the word calendar too many times clearly, but if you have it, it will automatically remind them to get ready for the show. So it will reduce the amount of no-shows, but also it just looks more professional on that form. You can ask them, hey, drop your bio here, drop a link to your headshot page. Like, it just simplifies everything and makes it look more professional. At some point in my career, I was managing 15 shows, and I was responsible for just making sure that the guest availability and the host availability matched. So sometimes I would be CC'd on emails, and these were like 3 people or 4 people on this email, and we had to like just go back and forth in these. And so if you're sending them a link, it's more immediate and reduces the amount of times that people can forget about booking a time, or just about the time and stress that it takes to be on a podcast. If you have all the elements there, it's just going to make everything easier. It's just easier. Everything is easier. Can't say easier more times. So just recapping, if you want to look more professional on your podcast, you will need a website, a podcast tab on your website, links to the podcast from your social media profiles, a bio document or an about page, and then a bio document that people can download on PDF format, or for instance, a public page with headshots, a document that they can download from there, or alternatively, a Google Drive where you have the document, the headshots, and just links to your social media and your website and your offers as well. Finally, a calendar link to book interviews. Again, you don't need to do everything in one sitting, but you need to make sure that these elements, these 6 elements, are there, within the next 6 months. So if you want to up-level your presence online, these 6 elements need to be there, right? And if you need to up-level your podcast growth, let's chat. It's time to book a podcast power hour with me to go over all of these elements and help you brainstorm elements that, that I didn't talk today that maybe will make sense in your situation. I'm at The Podcast Space, or you can reach out to me and browse the resources and get access to a ton of things, or even find inspiration from my own bio document at thepodcastspace.com/podcast. This is episode 16, so you just find episode 16 and you can click there. I'll have links to everything in the show notes too, and I'll just always love to talk to you, to hear about your wins. It's always fantastic to see you grow. So until next week, or until the next episode, I've been Anna Xavier, and this was The Podcast Space. Hopefully you got unstuck and got super inspired to continue to grow your podcast journey.